there, my name is Perry, and welcome to the Literary Nitterary. Good evening. I don't know if you remember this, but back in my mid-year book freakout tag, when asked what one of the books that I had to read, really wanted to read by the end of the year was, I mentioned that I have a quasi-tradition of reading a new translation of the Odyssey once every 2 years, and this would be an on-year for that. And then for my birthday, I was actually given Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, which is something that I am really excited to investigate. It is now very nearly the end of the year, and I have not read it yet. So I thought we could do something fun. There are 24 books in the Odyssey, so I thought we could do a fun little series called The 12 Days of Classics, where I would read and discuss 2 books of the Odyssey every day for 12 days, starting today on Christmas Day. Merry Christmas to those of you who celebrate, and continuing on until the book is done. Beyond that sort of general structure, I don't really have an idea of what these videos are going to be like, so I guess we will find out together, but let's get started.
With that, she tied her sandals on her feet, the marvelous golden sandals that she wears to travel sea and land as fast as wind. She took the heavy bronze-tipped spear she uses to tame the ranks of warriors with whom she is enraged. Then, from the mountain down, she sped to Ithaca, and stopped outside Odysseus's court, bronze spear in hand.
Okay, so I finished reading the first 2 books, and I have a couple of things I would like to chat about, if you will indulge me. For any of you who don't have your books to hand, in book 1 of the Odyssey, Athena is at a council of the gods, and she appeals to Zeus about Odysseus's plight, wanting to help him and help him finally get home. Zeus agrees to send Hermes to go get Odysseus, and then Athena goes down to Ithaca to tell Telemachus that his father is still alive, and that basically he should stop putting up with shit treatment from the suitors and go out and look for his dad, ask about him, inquire after him. And then in book 2, Telemachus calls an assembly with all of these sort of local bigwigs of Ithaca and complains about what the suitors are doing to him and his household. There's a conversation including the story of Penelope's shroud trick. Zeus sends an omen in the form of 2 eagles. There's more conversation. Athena helps Telemachus set up a ship, and they set sail. So as I discovered when I received the book, the Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey is done entirely in blank verse in iambic pentameter, which first of all is just insanely impressive, but second of all definitely has a really interesting effect while you are reading. I feel like the rhythm kind of propels you through the story a little bit, and it's also just really pretty. I also feel like in addition to the meter, there are more sort of sound devices used in the translation. There's more like assonance and consonants in some of the lines themselves, which again, you'll just be reading and be struck sort of by a very pretty sounding line. I should have marked more examples, but here's a random one I just picked from the middle of the page. The cup boy kept on topping up the wine. The suitors sauntered in and sat on chairs. Like, that's not an iconic line from the Odyssey, you know, it's not renowned for its imagery or for its content, but in this translation, that is very pretty to read. And I feel like when this translation is discussed in the media, the conversation is about how Emily Wilson is the first woman to have published a complete translation of the Odyssey, and therefore about how she has addressed some of the gendered elements in the story itself, and we overlook sort of some of the other possible intentions she had while creating this translation, of which writing it in meter is certainly a notable one. I don't necessarily think it is always or even usually productive to talk about trying to experience a work exactly the way that it would have been experienced by the original audience. For example, I don't think that's usually a useful exercise with Shakespeare plays, right? Trying to go back and figure out how it would have been originally performed. Like, you're never going to get back into the exact context of the original work, no matter how much effort you put in, it's just not going to happen. So you might as well let it live, and you might even discover something more interesting if you come to it with the context of the actual moment that you're working with in the present day, right? That's going to open you up to find new things in the work, rather than striving to recapture something that you'll never be able to get all the way back. But with that said, the original poem, the poem in Greek, is written in meter, and so reading a version of it that is in meter is a different experience, and it's an interesting experience because I know that the original poem is also in meter. Does that make sense? So I also pulled out the two other translations of the Odyssey that I have read. This one, which is translated by Robert Fagles and is a prose translation, and this one by Stanley Lombardo, which I would characterize as somewhere between sort of prose and like free verse poetry. This one is specifically written to emulate the way an oral storyteller working today might tell this story. So there's slight sort of inspirations from almost slam poetry. The lines are a little shorter, the language is a little more compact and condensed than in, for example, the Fagles version. And some of the idioms are almost updated as well. It has been 2 years since I've read this, so I'm not intimately familiar with it at this moment in time. So generally speaking, that was sort of the project of this one, was to be like, if I wanted to read this aloud or recite this aloud, what would it sound like? And then the project in Wilson's translation seems to at least partially be to capture some of the beauty of the language itself, some of the sound effects that you get in a poem, because we often discuss the Odyssey as an epic, but I feel like in modern scholarship, at least at the undergraduate level, we don't necessarily always treat it as a poem. So then I'm also really quickly going to compare the treatments of the same lines in these three different translations. Some of the big ones that you'll probably recognize. I do wish that I was in a position to comment on how well I think each of these lines captures the spirit of the original Greek, but unfortunately I do not yet read ancient Greek. I am in fact using my ancient Greek textbook as part of this tripod setup. So hopefully someday I will be able to comment on how well I feel each of these translations capture the essence or the meaning of the original, but that is unfortunately not within my ability to do for you today. If you read Greek and you have thoughts on that, I would absolutely love to hear them though. Okay, so we're going to compare the opening lines of these three different translations. First we have the Fagles. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw, and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heart-sick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. Then the Lombardo. Speak, memory, of the cunning hero, the wanderer, blown off course time and again after he plundered Troy's sacred heights. Speak of all the cities he saw, the mines he grasped, the suffering deep in his heart at sea as he struggled to survive and bring his men home. And finally, Wilson. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went, and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. So one of the things I think is interesting about the Wilson translation is that it feels like the invocation of the muse, it comes the latest in the Wilson translation. The Lombardo opens with speak, memory, and the Fagles opens with sing to me of the man, muse, and then goes into the man of twists and turns. I want to talk about both the way that twists and turns is encapsulated by the word complicated. I think that's really interesting, and then the fact that the sort of mention of the muse is deferred or delayed to the second line, which I also think is interesting. I think tell me about a complicated man is almost devastating in its directness, right? Like, I think it's a pretty standard line in classics classes that teach the Iliad and the Odyssey, is that, you know, they tell you what the poem is about. In the first line of the poem, the Iliad basically opens up with like, let's talk about the rage of Achilles, and the Odyssey basically opens up with like, let's talk about a twisty trickster man, and that's what they're about. Tell me about a complicated man just feels like it gets right to the heart of everything. And then I want to look at the opening of book 2, which is the first instance of the very famous epithet of like rosy-fingered Dawn, or Dawn with her red rose fingers. And again, that line is treated in 3 different ways in each of the 3 translations. So in the Fagles, when young Dawn with her rose-red fingers shone once more. In the Lombardo, Dawn's pale rose fingers brushed across the sky. And then in the Wilson, the early dawn was born, her fingers bloomed. Again, I'm not speaking from a position of the greatest authority here because I do not myself read ancient Greek, but I think this is one of the most sort of exciting things about translation, is the way that subsequent translators can evoke a different nuance, a different side of something conveyed in the same words in the original text. So in Fagles, it's pretty straightforward. It's young Dawn with her rose red fingers. Lombardo chooses to emphasize the personification and have Dawn brush her fingers across the sky, which creates a beautiful image. And then Wilson chooses to make the language even more compact and even tighter and create a totally unexpected image, something I had never thought about before, by saying her fingers bloomed. If I were judging this by the standards of the way that I read modern poetry, the way that I critiqued poetry in my creative writing classes, I would be really, really into her fingers bloomed, because I think part of the job of poetry is to present us with unexpected images, with ways we've never thought of something before, or to bring two things that we usually think of as far apart as close together, that we've never pictured interacting with each other before or modifying each other before. I think that is one of the real strengths of poetry. Part of the point of poetry is the language itself, and is giving you the chance to do something strange and new with language, with imagery. So if you couldn't tell, I'm really into that line, and I know that that specific epithet reoccurs several times throughout the Odyssey, so I'm kind of really excited to see how she treats it as it comes back up. Something else that was kind of interesting that I wanted to address was that in book 2, in one of the suitors' speeches, there's a description of Penelope, and perhaps it's because I was primed to sort of pay attention to the treatment of gender in this translation, because that's all that anybody talks about when they're talking about this translation. But the way that Wilson renders the description of Penelope caught my eye. She says, Athena blessed her with intelligence, great artistry and skill, a finer mind than anyone has ever had before. The passage is pretty similar in the Lombardo translation, mentioning the gifts Athena has given her, her talent for handiwork, her good sense, her cleverness. But the Fagles translation is significantly different and goes more like, so long as she persists in tormenting us, quick to exploit the gifts Athena gave her, a skilled hand for elegant work, a fine mind, and subtle wiles too. We've never heard the like, not even in old stories, blah, 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 blah. No one could equal Penelope for intrigue, but in this case she intrigued beyond all limits. So this is interesting because I feel like in the Lombardo and the Wilson translations, they're basically just discussing Penelope's intelligence, but in the Fagles translation, he's talking about something more akin to cunning, specifically intelligence applied to deceive or manipulate, basically, which, coming from the point of view of one of the suitors, makes a lot of sense. This is right after sort of the Penelope's shroud story has been told about her weaving by day and unweaving by night. And there's also a point to be made that using words like wiles and intrigue serves to draw a stronger parallel between Penelope and Odysseus, showing how well suited they are to each other by virtue of their cunning. I think it was just especially striking to me because I always get sort of surprised by that passage in book 1 where Penelope comes downstairs and asks the singer to sing a different song, and Telemachus basically yells at her and says, go back inside and do your work, it is for men to talk. Which is not to say that I'm surprised by an instance of misogyny in an ancient text. I'm certainly not. It's just that I always forget about that specific incident, and I'm surprised by its harshness when it appears. But it's interesting that the text can hold both a passage where Penelope's intelligence is praised and cited as a direct gift from Athena, where her similarities to Odysseus are highlighted, but also have her be so violently handled by this patriarchal system. The suitor's not listening to her, and even her own son dismissing her and reminding her of his status over her. So basically those are a few of the things that I found interesting after reading books 1 and 2 of the Odyssey as translated by Emily Wilson. I had a really positive experience getting started, and I'm definitely really excited to continue on in this. If you have any thoughts about the lines that we discussed or about the project of translation in general, if you've read this translation of the Odyssey or another translation, I would love to hear your thoughts about what goes on in books 1 and 2. Or if you don't have the energy for all of that, you can just leave me an emoji that symbolizes your favorite Greek god or goddess, and I will try to guess. If you liked this video, I do hope you will consider subscribing, and I will see you again soon. But in the meantime, I hope everybody is staying happy, healthy, and safe, and I hope that somewhere out there there's a great book waiting just for you. Merry Christmas to those of you who celebrate. Bye!